Baldur's Gate 3 is set to be the RPG of a generation, 20 years on from its predecessor. Let's jump in and take a look at 10 things that you really ought to know before we jump in an epic journey in Baldur's Gate 3. My name is JumboPixel. If you like this kind of stuff, do let me know. Let's jump straight through. Number 1, and really this is the place where it all begins. A character customizer in this beautiful D&D world. More on that in a minute, but firstly I think we should focus in on the level of detail here. In my personal experience, I spent about an hour working through this thing. What begins by something relatively simple. Select a race from a handful of options, each one with its own special features, traits and skills, truly making them feel unique. Once you move through selecting your sub-race, that's where the real customization comes through, in terms of cosmetics anyway, where you can basically design your look any which way or flavor you like. It's almost a little bit overwhelming, and that's before we actually get to the meat of it. Next, of course, you're tasked with selecting a class. Inside of that, there are subclasses, deities, or all kinds of other things that you can customize depending on the specific role. Maybe it's a variety of spells, or potentially the kinds of weapons that you'll yield. There is so much detail inside of every one of these classes. Each one almost makes the game entirely different. Now, of course, as you move through, you'll be able to potentially use your strength that you get from being a fighter, or maybe more your intelligence from being a sorcerer. I've found the classes have incredibly distinct flares, and honestly, I'm not yet even able to tackle all of them. The sheer scale of the character customizer in Baldur's Gate 3, right from the word go, had me wanting more. And really it's just the start. Reason being, and we'll get to it a little bit later in the video, is that you're actually not even stuck playing the main character that you've created, but instead joined by potentially a band of heroes, each with their own background, abilities, skills, and stories, because this isn't just a two-dimensional character creator. In fact, leaning into that just a little bit more, once you've finished pining over it for potentially hours, you'll then be asked to pine over what you dream of, who attracts you. This guardian-like figure, not only representing essentially your attractions, maybe some of them slightly nefarious in nature, I'll leave your bedroom wares up to you, but also guiding you through the game. Second up on my list, let's talk about this game being D&D at its finest. Now, during the character creation, as we've talked about, you get certain skills: strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma. And these are, of course, aligned with your D20, your 20-sided dice. So the closer you can get to 20, the better. Now, as you move through the game, and honestly at every single facet, mission, or storyline you'll come across it, you then need to use your skills through, of course, a dice roll, a quick skill check to see if you pass the test. There are a load of modifiers built in as well, depending maybe on the type of race you are or the skills that you've leaned into. Of course, some will be more challenging than others, depending on the feat that you're trying to achieve. But what Baldur's Gate 3 achieves by incorporating this in is a really meaningful character creator that stretches beyond that beginning of the game, as I say. Every decision that I'm making here, you can see I'm attempting maybe to persuade this woman, or instead actually, I might just read her mind. And providing, of course, I can meet the dice roll with any bonuses thrown in, then victory shall be mine. Failure hurts too, though, because Baldur's Gate 3 is a game where your choices really matter. And at any moment, if something maybe goes slightly wrong, say you're not the most charismatic tool in the shed, then you may, of course, have to resort to pulling out your weapons instead. Because, as I say, your choices matter. And if you're a more aggressive player, maybe you just go balls deep in the first place and whip out that sword. The choice is up to you. The third entry on my list is actually talking about those party members. As I mentioned earlier, you're not the only person in this story, and indeed you're not the only playable character in it either. There are a band of at least sort of 4 to 6 other main characters that you'll meet and pick up, and this is just in the early access version. If you choose to bring them into your team, they'll then become not just a playable character, but a character that brings their own background and story. And of course, just like you can with your main character that you've created, you'll be able to move through, level them up, get new abilities and experience, so it really allows the player to connect with them on a much more meaningful level. This is not just a blind follower in the Elder Scrolls Skyrim who you chuck all of your heavy crap onto so that they can lug it around for you and maybe one day get married. Although, thankfully, in Baldur's Gate 3 you can, if you wish, get married and, of course, get up to a little bit more than that too. Next up, item number 4, let's talk about Baldur's Gate itself. Not the game, but actually what is it? Baldur's Gate, the main city settlement, and in a recent video released only about a month ago from the team, they talked about the rich detail that they've tried to create inside of the city, and you can see various cinematic shots playing through on the video. The city itself is said to be a completely dynamic environment, much like the rest of the game, filled with characters that we can interact with, and of course, if the interactions that we've seen are anything to go by already, we know that there'll be many, many complex, sometimes branching paths for us to choose from. As well as the external threats to the city, which will feature in much of the storylines, at least if the early access build is anything to go by, there's also internal politics at play, vying factions competing for power and control over the city, and I think it'll pull the entire story together and really show what Baldur's Gate 3 has to offer, not just in its complexity, but also in its scale, which is something that really has me flabbergasted. Moving through to the 5th entry on my list, let's focus in a little bit more on the interactability of the world, because that's really what sets a face value, shallow RPG aside from something like Baldur's Gate 3. And of course, it has all of the kinds of things that you would expect to go alongside the interactions. For example, quite a detailed trade and barter system where you can, of course, pick up all kinds of sweet loot and gear. And equally, if you happen to dispatch of a couple of enemies, well, they'll have gear for you as well that you might take back to your campsite to rest, reconvene, and pick up some extra followers, although that is not really doing them a service. As you move through and progress and level up, you'll up your skills, maybe get some new spells, weapons, and different things that you can use, not just in combat, but also in this very story-rich world. There are so many options on offer at every turn that Baldur's Gate 3 ends up having an incredible amount of outcomes. We'll talk a little bit more about that in my final point. Do take care though, because the world around you is completely interactable and destructible. And if you're anything like me, you might accidentally stumble across what is effectively an explosive barrel and destroy your entire party and hopes of your campaign. Don't fear though, you can reload, of course, providing you've remembered to keep a save. The 6th item on my list, let's talk a little bit specifically about the story. There won't be a huge number of spoilers, but I would like to touch on the mind flayers a little bit at the start. This is essentially the prologue to the game, and in a nutshell, you, my friend, have got a tadpole inside of your brain, but it's not any old tadpole. No, it's kind of a disgusting alien one that has this symbiotic relationship with you where sometimes it's controlling you and other times you can utilize its power to take control over the world around you, because it gives you this ability to coerce, to distract, and to manipulate people using those special effects. So it's up to you how you balance the need to get this parasite out of your mind before it completely takes over your body and tears you apart, but also to utilize a little bit of its strength and power. It's a very difficult, tenuous relationship that plays through at least most of the early access storyline, and it leads to some really fascinating outcomes. But no more spoilers here. Let's move through to the next section. Number 7 for me, and this is where the strategic layer comes through, so regular viewers of the channel, sit back and take note. Inside of combat, it's really a turn-based system, something kind of like XCOM, although that wouldn't really be quite doing it justice. Up the top, you can see all of the people in the fight, and obviously you control your own. It's turn-based, so each character does their attack, and then it moves through to the next one. It's not just a great system to work with because the terrain is there, you can jump, dive, hide, use stealth, or go guns blazing. It's also quite interesting because you can trigger it whenever you like. If you'd like to enter combat and quickly take someone down because you regretted the decisions that you made when you were talking to them, then you can do just that. Now, if you've been paying close attention, you might notice there's a lot of things that you can choose to do in combat, even at what this is a very early stage in the game. But I would encourage you not to be too overwhelmed by that. Because Baldur's Gate 3 uses the turn-based system for its combat, it allows you to play around a bit. You can sit, take a read, think about the kinds of things you want to do, and experiment with them. And of course, alongside aggressive abilities, there are a whole host of other really interesting things. Taking control of animals, summoning in familiars, healing yourself and your allies. It's got all of the layers that you would expect from a really interesting turn-based tactical combat system that you might see in much more advanced strategy games. And here it is inside of an RPG. The 8th item on my list, this one's a little bit personal. Being an a-hole. As we've discussed, there are many branching paths in Baldur's Gate 3, and if you wish, you can just say, you know what, I'm just going to let the world burn. This little kid, this little merchant here wants me to take something from them in exchange for some cash. No, I don't think so. I think I'm just going to keep it. And I'm not going to look at anything else you have to offer me because stuff you, little devil boy. And it also moves through back into that interactability with the world. Here you can see 3 people simply enjoying a nice day out, sitting next to their torch, and oh boy, here comes me with my magical water staff, not only drenching them, but also putting out that fire. It's the little things being an a-hole in this world that bring me much joy. At number 9, and taking it a little bit more seriously now, on those branching paths, Baldur's Gate 3 has, according to the developers, around 17,000 ending variations. Some of them, of course, naturally won't have a lot between them. But given the variations that are available within even just relatively minor quests themselves, you ultimately determine whether you want the quest giver to be alive or not much of the time. It really speaks to, I think, how this will scale up over the course of Baldur's Gate 3. And if we want to talk a little bit about how those branching paths play out in terms of game time, well, looking through what the developers have said, they've said that roughly a game could take around 100 hours if you blitz through, stick mostly to the main story. If, however, you want to pick up some of these side quests, side journeys, and really get a little bit more into the world, you could expect around 200, potentially up to around 250 hours playing time. So you could sit down and play it for 10 days straight, and then start it all again with a different class and a different set of abilities. And finally, moving through to number 10 on my list, let's talk the juicy details. If you're watching this video before Baldur's Gate 3 has came out, you will likely know that it's been in early access on PC for a number of years. Since then, and here's some detail if you'd like to pause and read it, I've noticed significant improvements in its performance. It's releasing August 3rd on PC and around a month later on PS5. Thanks for joining me today for this Baldur's Gate 3 video. Let me know if you'd like some more, and I'll see you next time.